Our issue today is Syria. Syria, the history, Syria, the geography, Syria, the society, Syria, the communities. As Dr. Ghiath said in his introductory remarks, he said that looking at you from over this podium, you look a beautiful crowd. I would add, humbly speaking, vividly speaking, that you are not only beautiful, you are real representatives of the real Syria I am talking about. When we speak about the so-called components of the Syrian society, people may tend to say, you know what, we have in Syria Assyrians, we have Chaldeans, we have Kurds, we have, of course, Arabs, we have Sunni, Shia, whatever. Armenians, I will tell you a story about the Armenians' fidelity to Syria. But before that, let me stress on one point. In Syria, we have Syrian Kurds, we have Syrian Assyrians, we have Syrian Armenians, we have Syrian Sunni, Syrian Shia, whatever. The word Syria should come before. This is how we preserve our country. Syrian Jewish. Syrian Jewish. No wonder that in these bloody events that Syria has witnessed so far, inter alia, among others, the oldest synagogue in the world was targeted in Jobar in the suburbs of Damascus. This is not a coincidence. This is not a coincidence. Those terrorists have targeted mosques, churches, but also synagogues. And mosques, of course. The pitiful scene in the minds of some people is that some people who are not Syrians, is that they think that they could do to Syria what they did to Iraq, what they did to Libya, what they did to Somalia, Afghanistan, and elsewhere. Unfortunately, you know, the examples are too long. If they could have done this to Syria, we wouldn't be here today, addressing you after 5 years of what Dr. Ghiath said and qualified as the Syrian crisis. With all my respect to Dr. Ghiath, I will explain why I don't believe in this term. It is not a Syrian crisis. It's an international thugs and mobs war against Syria. Reports emanating from the United Nations, not from the newspaper Tishreen or Al-Thawra or Al-Ba'ath, have indicated that after 4 years of total denial of the presence of terrorist foreigners in Syria, after 4 years of total denial, the United Nations experts came up with reports corroborating what we kept saying for 4 years, that there are terrorists coming from 100 countries and that their number is 25,000. But still, I am skeptical with regard to the figure. Our own estimate is that we have 80,000 terrorists operating in Syria to destroy Syria and to harm the image of our society. Of course, we have proofs, we have evidences, we have whatever you want. And all these evidences are kept accordingly in the Security Council archives, as well as in the Office of the Secretary General of the United Nations. So nobody could deny anything anymore. We have names, we have nationalities, we have almost everything with regard these mercenaries enrolled by the dirty Gulf money and trained by the Turks, the Jordanians, and others. And the money, of course, I said it comes from the Gulf states, as well as the ugly ideology coming from Saudi Arabia. We will come to all these points. There is no secret anymore with regard what's going on in Syria. Anybody who has still some doubts or skepticism with regard what's going on in Syria, he has a problem nowadays. Anybody who casts any doubt with regard what's going on in Syria, he has a problem himself. Otherwise, is it a coincidence that after 4 years of total denial, as I said, the 15 heads of states or government of the 15 members of the Security Council came all together to endorse the Security Council Resolution 2178, which condemns, prohibits all kind of sponsoring of terrorism, all kind of enrollment of terrorists, all kind of cross-border mercenaries operations. Is it a coincidence? It is not. It is not, because even those who are somehow involved in the Syrian bloodshed came to the Security Council to endorse this resolution. So nowadays it is not a civil war in Syria. Some people would like to qualify the Syrian crisis as a civil war. It is not. Some others say, you know what? It's a dictatorship killing its own people. It's not. Some others say, you know what? It's about animosity and hatred among the communities living in Syria. It is not. So from here and there, you may hear different versions of political analysis about what's going on in Syria. But none of these versions is accurate. The only truth, and nothing but the truth, is that the war in Syria, it's a war between terrorism and the Syrian government, and nothing else. We have many times made references to these acronymous names, you know, أبو هريرة الأمريكي وأبو قحطان الأردني وأبو سعدان السعودي وأبو صرصور الكويتي Should I translate?
Making fun of their names.
So, I mean, you know, all these terrorists, of course, they are not being sent by their own governments, but somehow it was extremely easy for an Australian to leave Sydney and finds himself out of a sudden in Aleppo or in the countryside of Damascus. How did he cross all these 15,000 kilometers separating Australia from Syria? So, of course, he got visas for all the countries he crossed on his way. He changed his plane many times. He ended up in Istanbul, where good guys were waiting for him at the airport. And then they escorted him to an area somewhere next to the Syrian border, where he was trained and paid the Gulf dirty dollars, and then sent to heaven in Syria. But at least at the end of the day, they tell him Syria is a heaven, so they know that Syria is a heaven. And finally, this guy, or this girl, because nowadays, there are jihad for both sex. This boy or this girl keeps killing Syrians until they are being killed by the Syrians. So this is the issue. This is the whole story. We get rid of this garbage all over the world. We send them to Syria to kill the Syrians and be killed by the Syrians. And when some of them tries to get back to their homeland, the British Prime Minister or the Australian Prime Minister makes a statement saying, you know what, these terrorists, we will withdraw the citizenship from them so that they will not get back to Australia or England. What does that mean? That means keep killing the Syrians over there until you are killed by the Syrians. This is incitement to terrorism. This is called, according to the UN language, incitement to terrorism. We asked the Security Council recently to add a new entity as a terrorist entity. In the Security Council, they have special list of entities, terrorist entities. So we asked recently the Security Council to incorporate in the list the name of a new entity in Syria, created in Syria recently by the Saudi and the Turks, called Katibat al-Mujahideen wal-Ansar. And of course, we presented all the evidences that these guys are terrorist mercenaries coming from outside. They refused. They refused to insert this entity on their list of entities sponsoring terrorism. They don't want to single out these terrorist entities.
Did they say why?
Of course. They say that, you know what, if you want to insert this entity, then let us insert with it Hezbollah. This is their answer. This is their answer. But I'm just giving you an example about the diplomatic war, because the war is not only a military one. We are engaged in a diplomatic and political war at all fronts. Is it also a coincidence that this terrorist entity called Daesh is being helped by the Saudis, the Qataris, and the Turks from, in the north, our border with Turkey, downward to the south, to the Saudi border? Why? We should ask ourselves why they choose to plant Daesh in this area, from the Saudi border to the Saudi border, from the Turkish border to the Saudi border. The reason is very simple, because many politicians in the world, they call themselves seculars, but they are not. They are not. All their concern and obsession is to break what they call the Shiite crescent, that they kept talking about it for years. They think that everything in the area taking place is about religion. It is not. It is not. If we follow this propaganda, we would lose the war. We shouldn't endorse such a wrong analysis. This is wrong. And it is dangerous. And it will lead nowhere, especially in Syria. As His Beatitude said, we want peace. We want genuine peace, peace of the braves. But we will never capitulate. We will never surrender. We want a genuine peace. A peace that preserves the identity of Syria. A peace worked out by the Syrians themselves without any foreign interference. A peace that will not lead to the division of Syria. A peace that will preserve the coexistence and cohabitation, you name it, cohesion. I don't like any of these words, but just for the sake of the conversation, I'm saying it. We don't need cohabitation or coexistence or cohesion or whatever in Syria. These words are artificial, in my humble opinion. We need to be Syrians, full stop. This is how we lived for thousands of years, and this is how we intend to continue living on the land of our homeland. Only in Syria you have the grave of John the Baptist in the middle of the mosque. Only in Syria you have a mufti's advisor who is Christian. Only in Syria, when we form a government or cabinet, we don't look into the identity of the new ministers. We may have mistakes. We have a lot of mistakes. But we don't repair mistakes by committing a collective suicide or by surrendering the country to mobs and thugs. Chechens wouldn't like Syria much more than you. A Georgian, a Saudi, Libyan, Tunisian, you name it, whatever, wouldn't like Syria much more than you. And just as a joke, 4 guys from Burkina Faso got killed in Syria. Burkina Faso. Could you imagine that? They were indoctrinated and told to go to Syria for jihad. They forgot to make jihad in Palestine. And the Saudis nowadays found out that fighting the poor Yemenis is a legitimate war. For decades, the Saudis never thought for a second about making jihad for the Palestinians.